So the wheel decided at the end of the Harbour video that the next agent to do is Cypher, but my good friend Killian suggested I do Phoenix instead, but in this case I actually wanted to do Cypher, so sue me. First thing I did was decide on these accessories and base colours. I had two of these waist capes because I thought I could use the brown for the inside and the white for the outside, but it turns out it was barely visible on the finished figure, so what can you do? This scarf piece was horizontally flipped, this hat piece ended up not being used at all, and this blue stud was originally going to be his trap trigger, but it ended up being way too big in the minifigure's hands, so I deleted it. The biggest challenge with his face print was just positioning his eyes. I knew I wanted to size them to be equal to the size of a regular minifigure's pupils, like the white part, and I figured at the same scale that the spacing between the eyes could be the same as well, and to be fair it could for a while, but I ultimately moved them to be much further apart than usual, because there's a lot of shaping and detail going on around Cypher's eyes that I think looked too compressed otherwise. Choosing what colours surrounded his eyes was pretty tricky, and I actually decided on a medium nougat as the base for the gold because I figured his face was mostly in the shade under his big hat. For the rest of the figure, flame yellowish orange was the base with medium nougat as the shadow, but for this print medium nougat was the base and flame yellowish orange was the highlight. But I then added a highlight to that highlight on his face print using a cool yellow, so they kind of shifted down again. What can you do? Sometimes you just gotta experiment. His torso print was actually pretty annoying for two main reasons. First of all, you had this huge flat area in the middle with no detail at all, not even any creases, so no matter how detailed I made this print, I was never satisfied or comfortable with it because of this flat area. But this was more of a me problem, and it's something I got over as the rest of the figure progressed. The more annoying part was the pattern on that blue section towards the top of his chest. It has all these like eye prints on it that were all kind of laid out in a grid and angled diagonally and underneath a different bigger eye print. This was really annoying to try and match up because the scale was hard to decide on, and I had to try and make the details line up with where they'd hit the bigger eye that I had to keep invisible most of the time. It was just a whole thing. A less annoying but more just generally challenging part was deciding on the colours for the belt and just the brown parts of this area in general. On the in-game model the browns lean in a more darker greyish colour, but the concept art is more of a lighter brown colour. Honestly I just kind of winged it and picked whichever shade of brown looked nicest after experimenting with a few different ones, and I think it worked out fine. The waist print was a pain in the ass because my drawing pen just decided to stop being pressure sensitive at 3 AM, so I spent a while trying to troubleshoot it, which is always fun. I eventually fixed it, and this ended up being one of the simpler waist prints. There's a noticeably long section of coat here on the character between his belt and his pants, so I figured that the length of the hip piece was a good approximation for it. And the print itself was mostly just straight lines and continuing details from the torso print, so no big deal. The leg prints were completely symmetrical on both sides, which is always handy, and the prints themselves weren't actually as difficult as I thought they'd be. Once I decided on the base colours for the pants, boots, and the shin pad things he has, filling in these details was fairly intuitive, and I really liked the result. After that, I decided that the waist print needed some more work, so I went back and added some details to it, including the crotch print, which was surprisingly difficult. I kind of struggled with filling the area under the crotch that would be empty space on the character, and eventually just decided on all grey to make it look natural even if it's a little inaccurate. I posed the character next. Here's a before and after because I've come to realise that time-lapsing the posing process is a huge waste of storage space and ultimately just results in a visually incomprehensible mess, so why bother? I did his left arm next because that's the only one facing the camera, and this print was unremarkable, honestly. I struggled a little bit with finding space for the grey rectangles on his forearm, but other than that it was all intuitively spaced, and even the colours kind of decided themselves based on what I used for the rest of the character. My next step was rendering the character multiple times with different sized hats, and this is where I fucked up. I figured I could do my erasing trick for its shape and just manually colour in the details of the blue and gold parts. Unfortunately I made a grave mistake in overlooking that extremely important and prominent triangular shape in the middle of his hat. So all I was giving myself to work with was the basic shape of a plain white cowboy hat, so I had a pretty hard time to say the least. The first thing I did was just remove the scope from the pistol to replicate the shape of the ghost, no big deal. Next step was adjusting the shadow under the hat to not cover too much of the face, and just generally get that pointed shape of his hat on there. Again, not too crazy. But the next step was me trying to draw in that 3D shape onto his hat by hand. Now, I gave this my best go, I really did, but drawing in a 3D shape to such a high degree of realism that it doesn't stand out on a photorealistic render of this figure is a little bit beyond my abilities. So even though it kinda looked passable at a glance, it just didn't sit right with me at all, and there was no way I was gonna settle for this. And so, it finally happened. The day had come, and I had little choice but to do the thing I was dreading most since starting these custom minifigures. I actually had to 3D model in Blender a little bit. What I did was basically take a cube, rotate it, and put 4 other cubes around the outside before sticking a sphere in the middle. To anyone with more than, say, 2 days of Blender experience, this is laughably, pathetically simple. But honestly, all I needed was to get the basic broad shapes of that detail physically rendered so I can Photoshop accordingly. So like, whatever, it'll do. I rendered the figures a few more times with my new 3D modeled masterpiece on a few different hat colors, because I also realized that I could just do that instead of coloring these in myself for some reason, before bringing these new renders into Photoshop and finally adjusting them properly. I added a shadow to the right side of his hat before I realized that that was just not the angle that the sun was facing, so I switched it to the other side before fixing this white glowing reflection from the scarf piece, and with that, finally, there you go, the finished figure. When I originally looked at Cypher, I thought he'd be among the easier agents, so this was definitely more than I bargained for. Now we spin the wheel to see who's next. I have nothing to add really, these VALORANT characters are all the same to me. Okay, I think Omen... okay, I think Omen's among the easier characters to do.